Hello, generations, young, old, and everyone in between. Welcome to Generation Apollo, where we prepare young minds to fight tyrants on multiple fronts. I am the voice of a generation. And today, I want to speak to all of you about something really important that threatens the freedom and prosperity of millennials and Generation Z. You don't have to look far to see that ever since the 2016 election, America has been bitterly divided in ways that haven't been seen since the 1960s. The far left accuses anyone who doesn't agree with them as being racist, sexist, and fascist, while the far right accuses anyone who doesn't agree with them as being communist socialist parasites. And so, that leaves many of us in the middle wondering, where have all the moderate, sensible opinions gone? Well, if you're among those millennials and Gen Zers who've recognized that both of these extreme camps are equally bad, then congratulations! You've already taken the first step towards fixing the problem. Because how can you expect to solve a problem if you can't even see it for what it really is? And the truth is that authoritarians exist on both the left and the right sides of the political spectrum. Because the problem that we're facing isn't one of left versus right. What it really is all about is those who wish to live free versus those power-hungry narcissists who want to impose their will on society and destroy my generation. The whole veneer of left versus right is just that, a veneer. Nothing more than window dressings. I would say the only real difference between the two is that the left-leaning authoritarians want to control you via the state, while the right-leaning authoritarians want to control you via the private sector through big corporations and, most importantly, religious institutions. Case in point, those of you listening who are old enough to remember back in the 80s and 90s probably might remember the Satanic Panic. And for those of you who don't, well, it was basically a time when a bunch of Stone Age professional Christians were screaming about how rock and heavy metal music needed to be banned because they said it was the devil's influence. And while some bands did openly sing about Satan, who the hell cares? Lots of people grew up listening to this music, myself included, and I don't remember any of my friends ever trying to summon the Prince of Darkness after listening to Ozzy. In later years, those same nutjobs also went on to claim that Pokemon was somehow demonic? How? I don't know. How the hell should I know? Don't ask me to figure out what goes on in the heads of these mental cases. I mean, I never got into the whole Pokemon thing, but still, what the fuck? What the hell? Anyway, the last time I heard from them, they also were trying to make the case that Harry Potter was evil because it promoted witchcraft. Now, thankfully, nobody listened to these lunatics, but that didn't stop them from trying to violate the First Amendment because they said it needed to be done to protect the children. And that's another thing you hear from these authoritarians on both sides. They all claim to want to protect the children.
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
But those of us that have two brain cells to rub together and who aren't swayed by fear-mongering know better. We know that it isn't really about protecting the children. It's about grabbing more power for themselves. The authoritarians want to control your social habits and take away your escapisms because they find them to be offensive or they deem them to be a waste of time. And that's all part of their strategy of trying to claim the moral high ground, which both sides do, by the way, in order to justify draconian ambitions. The right uses the virtue of decency, while the left uses the issue of human rights. And again, both sides will take these virtues to extremes to justify the most outlandish ideas and behaviors. I'll delve more into how the left-leaning variant of authoritarians does this in just a minute, but let's get back to the right-wingers first. Now, these are the types of authoritarians that I would call the confrontational type, and they're the ones that are most commonly associated with the far right. Now, luckily, they're very easy to spot because when someone comes at you in an antagonistic manner right off the bat, your defenses are going to go up immediately. If someone gets in your face and tells you that your hobbies or interests are immoral and that you're a bad person for liking them, or that you're a bad person for simply being who you are, then you're going to tell that person to kindly fuck off. And rightly so. That's why the far right hasn't been able to make much headway, even though it's been part of the American landscape for decades. Even under Republican presidents, the far right hasn't been able to gain anywhere close to enough power to have any national influence. So, we have been able to inoculate ourselves against the far right, for the most part. Sure, the authoritarian right pops up from time to time, but their momentum never lasts long, again, because we can see the threat that they pose at first glance, so we can stop them before they get their foot in the door. The last time the authoritarian right made an attempt at a comeback was in the months immediately after Trump's election. However, the events in Charlottesville ended up backfiring big time for the far right, forcing them to once again go back underground. So, even under President Trump, who has literally been called the fascist in chief, the authoritarian right still can't make any significant headway. So, when the authoritarians realized they weren't making any progress, they decided to change tactics and try a new approach. One that would prove to be much more effective. And so now, let's look at the authoritarians on the far left side of the aisle. Unlike the confrontational right-leaning authoritarians, the leftists used a much more underhanded method, that being deception. These deceptive types of authoritarians will always try to appeal to your sense of morality. Remember earlier when I said that both the left and the right try to use morality? Well, this is how the left does it. Now, the left-leaning deceptive authoritarian will start by hijacking legitimate causes. Things like wanting to end sexism, racism, and homophobia. Obviously, the majority of us can agree that these things are wrong and should absolutely be opposed. That's how the deceptive authoritarian gets their foot in the door. They'll typically start by saying something like, "Do you oppose sexism?" And you'll naturally say, "Of course, sexism is wrong," which I completely agree, it is wrong. Then, the authoritarian will ask you if women should have equal pay and job opportunities. And you'll say, "Of course they should." And again, I completely agree with that. Then, the authoritarian will step it up a bit and say, "There's not enough women in corporate boardrooms and leadership positions. We need to address that." And you say, "Okay," because you still don't suspect anything is wrong at this point. Then the authoritarian says, "We're having trouble finding qualified women for leadership positions, so we need to lower the standards to make it easier for them and prioritize the hiring of women over men, regardless of qualifications." Okay, now your spidey senses are probably starting to tingle, but maybe you still keep quiet so as not to stir the pot. Then the authoritarian says, "Women are not paid fairly and therefore need a substantial pay raise." But you know that's provably not true when you take into account things like job type, industry, experience, and of course maternity leave. You also realize that we've already had laws in place for decades that make it illegal to pay women less for the same work. But maybe you still don't say anything at this point because you don't want to be that guy who goes against the grain. Then one day, you make an innocent joke or comment that seems funny to most sensible people, but doesn't sit well with one of your overly sensitive colleagues. Suddenly, you're being called into your boss's office where you get lectured on minding your language because some people find certain words or ideas to be offensive, those people being the authoritarians that want to control you. Or worse, your boss just fires you on the spot because he or she doesn't want to be accused of fostering a hostile work environment. You protest and say you've done nothing wrong and that you've been a loyal, productive employee for years, but that doesn't matter because certain people have determined that you are a problem that needs to be removed. But wait, it gets even worse. You soon discover that this problem isn't limited to just your workplace, but it's also prevalent online, where people who express certain opinions are censored, publicly shamed by outrage mobs, or banned altogether. Now, by now, you've probably figured out that something is terribly wrong, but it's too late. The deceptive authoritarians have now infiltrated into positions of influence and power in the government, businesses, the media, and academia. And that's when the harsh reality hits you like a freight train. You are surrounded. You are surrounded by these authoritarians. This is what makes these deceptive authoritarians of the left so insidious, and why they've been so successful. Because unlike the confrontational authoritarians, they don't trigger our internal alarms right away, allowing them to slowly accumulate power. And by the time you've figured out what their true intentions are, they've become like a cancer that has metastasized, thus becoming significantly harder to fight. This is why the far left has made more progress in less than a decade than the far right has in more than 30 years. Think about it. The left has managed to do what the far right has always dreamed of, that being stripping all traces of sex appeal from television, movies, comic books, and video games, as well as censoring dissenting opinions online. Now our entertainment mediums are filled with overweight androgynous SJWs, all in the name of protecting the fragile egos of ugly people who are too lazy to try to improve themselves. That's why you hardly hear from the far right anymore, because the authoritarian left has unknowingly given them exactly what they wanted. It makes perfect sense because people on both sides of these extreme ends tend to be physically unattractive, have horrible personalities, and usually like to blame others for their own failures. Now, it doesn't stop here, because if you think simply achieving power is the final step in the deceptive authoritarians' plan, nope! There's one more insidious trick they have up their sleeve. Once the deceptive authoritarians are confident that they've infiltrated enough positions of authority and influence to secure their power, that's when the mask comes off, and the initial kind face of, "we just want to stop sexism and racism," is replaced with the ugly face of, "you're a privileged white male racist fascist who needs to submit to the almighty vagina!"
They're afraid of women. They're afraid of the almighty uterus. Almighty uterus!
And once they've achieved power, the next step is figuring out how to cement and maintain it. The confrontational authoritarian would usually use the threat of physical harm to keep people in line, but the deceptive authoritarian instead prefers the divide and conquer method of pitting one section of the population against another. So, the deceptive authoritarian needs to have a scapegoat ready to blame society's problems on, so that the public is too distracted to realize how incompetent their leaders really are. And that scapegoat usually being some vulnerable minority. This is necessary because the deceptive authoritarian is completely incapable of running a society efficiently. Of course, this is true of all authoritarians, but I digress. And right now, the soup du jour seems to be to blame white males for all the problems that non-whites and women are facing. Unfortunately, though, the white man's success in building stable and prosperous societies, coupled with his dark history, makes him an easy target, because there isn't a single racial group on the entire planet that hasn't had at least one negative interaction with men of white European descent. Yes, white people have done some horrible things to other peoples in the past, but so have other races. Slave trades are still common in parts of the Middle East and Africa to this day. In parts of Latin America, blacks are still treated as second-class citizens by the native Hispanics. And for all you history buffs, there was once a period in time when white people were traded as slaves by Muslims along the Mediterranean. But you'll never hear of any of this mentioned in the mainstream media. You'll never hear this mentioned on the nightly news because that doesn't play into the deceptive authoritarians' narrative. Now, whites aren't a minority in the US, well, not yet at least. That's why you see this major push to import millions of third world migrants, because the deceptive authoritarians are trying to import a new voter base that they can manipulate into keeping them in power. My fellow millennials and Generation Z, while many of you have done a superb job in resisting the confrontational authoritarians, an alarmingly large number of you have failed to resist the deceptive authoritarians. Not only are many of you not fighting back against them, many of you are actively aiding and abetting these tyrants and helping them to achieve their evil goals. I find this highly disturbing. I find it highly disturbing to know that such large swaths of my generation have been so thoroughly brainwashed into believing the words of these wolves in sheep's clothing. Do not be fooled by their sweet-sounding lies of wanting to end sexism, racism, homophobia, etc., whatever. Because I can assure you that that is not their true intent. It never was. The deceptive authoritarians have hijacked these noble causes and twisted them in ways that the original founders of these initiatives never intended. They have perverted these causes for their own selfish and evil purposes. And many millennials and Gen Zers are not only not resisting these authoritarians, but they're actually helping them to become even more entrenched in power. You know, as much as I criticize the boomers for all the terrible and stupid things that they've done during their time in power, Millennials and Generation Z are committing their own sins. Demanding that free speech be silenced on college campuses, then demanding that those same colleges provide safe spaces to protect those who can't stand to hear opinions they don't like. And most of all, the rise of cancel culture as a form of punishment for those who dare to say the wrong things. All those things are being pushed by the millennials and Gen Z, and we can be legitimately blamed for doing so, not only by our elders, but also by future generations of young people. This is exactly what the authoritarians want, and I'm watching as my generation is actively playing into their trap. I've always said that my greatest fear, the only thing that I fear for my generation more than us ending up less fortunate than our parents, is if we turn out to be exactly like them. And right now, we're dangerously close to seeing that happen. If the millennials and Gen Z do not wake up and fight back against these deceptive authoritarian narcissists, we won't turn out to be like our parents. We could end up being worse. And that is something I absolutely do not want to see happen. But I believe that we will ultimately do what's right, because we naturally want to do what's right. But that natural instinct that my generation has been co-opted by some very bad actors with nefarious intentions. This is not by accident, because predators like the deceptive authoritarians don't choose their victims randomly. They look for people with traits that signal that they're susceptible to manipulation. And that's why these authoritarians have hijacked the left, so they could prey on and exploit the left's natural inclination towards empathy and social causes. But now you guys know the differences. Now you guys, millennials, Gen Z, you know the differences between the authoritarians on the left and the right. And now they have been exposed for anyone smart enough to see. The question is, can my generation snap out of it and break the spell that has poisoned so many young minds? Can we overthrow these authoritarians before they usher in a new dark age and steal my generation's inalienable rights to freedom? Despite the seemingly bleak odds, I will say this to my fellow millennials. I believe in you. I believe in you because God knows our generation doesn't hear that enough, and we need to hear stuff like that a lot more often. So I'm doing my part to hopefully rally some fighting spirit in those of you who will listen, because your future and the futures of those who will come after you depend on it. And with that, I'll end today's lesson here. So if you enjoyed this video, let me know in the comments. Give it a thumbs up, subscribe, like, and share. And don't forget to also follow me on BitChute, Minds.com, and Twitter. The links will be in the description. So, thanks again for watching, and thank you for tuning in to Generation Apollo.